Hey, welcome everyone. Today I'm doing a live podcast and webinar with Rob Chesnut. Um, and I'm so thrilled to have you here. So hang on a second. I got to find your amazing bio. So where is it? I put it here on my screen. Fantastic. So Rob is the former chief ethics officer at Airbnb, a role he took on in late 2019 after nearly 4 years as the company's general counsel. He previously led eBay's North America legal team, where he founded the internet's first e-commerce person-to-person platform trust and safety team. He was general counsel at Clegg Inc. for nearly 6 years and served 14 years with the U.S. Justice Department, where you dealt with an espionage case, right?
I did, yes. Spies.
Spies. We love spies. Maybe you can tell some spy stories.
Big spy story,
So,
sure.
yeah, let's start with a good spy. So, with a spy boy like you, doing in a place like this, Silicon Valley,
I know,
sort
right?
of.
It's spies are fun, but I tell you, it's tough putting people in jail. It's a very negative profession, Margarita. I like the idea of helping people and building something positive. So that's why I moved out here.
Okay. So you joined eBay in the very early days, right? And so this is the days of e-commerce. And I remember I was there during the whole dot-com era, the rise, boom, and then bust. And eBay was one of the breakout stars during that period. But I remember like everyone was really, really nervous about e-commerce. Like, is it safe? If you order something, are you actually going to get it? All of that. What was it like to be at eBay in those early days? And you know, how did the need for safety and trust emerge?
Yeah, you know what? You're right. It was a different time. I joined eBay with only 170 people. And back then, if you wanted to buy something, you had to send a personal check or a money order. I remember going to the post office and getting money orders and putting them in an envelope and putting my stamp on there and sending it to the seller, thinking to myself, boy, I sure hope they send me the item. Uh, so times have changed, but trust is still at the center of things, right? I think places like eBay and Airbnb and the like, they're in the trust business. They're in the business of helping two strangers connect with each other through the internet and do business with each other, or even stay under the same roof together. And so I do
Yeah.
believe that if you want to build trust in a platform, you have to operate with integrity, because all the data shows that what drives trust among human beings and what drives trust between human beings and companies, competence and integrity. So you got to believe that the other party
Right.
is capable, and you got to also believe that they operate with integrity.
Yeah, was it like we use Airbnb quite a bit in the lab, or in my talks and research at Stanford, as this company that really focused on trust. And we actually taught a course in the D school on how to design for trust and saying like, if you look in the literature, there are all these different models for trust. But how do you do trust that scales? It's one thing, so like, okay, Rob, you and I are going to build trust because we're gonna talk to each other, we're going to build rapport, we're going to look at each other, all these different signals that we pick up either directly or subconsciously. Is this person trustworthy? And reliability is a huge one, right? If the person's flaky, you're going to like, I don't think so. But that's like interpersonal. But how do you get millions of people to trust each other? And how do you do that at scale? I mean, that to me was the remarkable thing about eBay and especially about Airbnb, because we're talking about um, it's one thing to send a money order and hopefully you'll get that, that rare thing that you're
Baby,
looking
baby,
for,
right?
an auction. It's another thing altogether to let a perfect stranger into your home. Certainly in the early days when people say, okay, I have a spare guest room. It's like, you know,
Right.
how did they
It's
figure
a
that
challenge, right?
out?
Well, doing it at scale, we started in eBay. The very first internet trust device was the feedback system, and
Mhm.
Piero Midyar came up with it. And to this day, I think it's still fundamental to so many websites, like on Amazon and on Yelp and the like. Everybody's got a review system. Everybody's got a certain number of stars. And I think that's still pretty powerful, right? At
Mhm.
eBay, everybody looks to see, what's the rating of the host, and everybody
Right.
wants to know what the rating of the guest is, because um, as long as the system has integrity, as long as the
Mhm.
platform is operating their feedback system in a way that shows care, there's nothing like learning about what other people's experiences are. If you were a great uh, guest at a home with another host, that is very convincing for the next host. But if you trash the place,
Mhm.
you're going to have a tough time staying somewhere else. I think learning about what other people's experiences have been with you remains, I think, at the heart of so many trust systems, and Airbnb's is no exception. I think another angle to it, though, is insurance or
Mhm.
assurance. That is the platform going to be there for you if something goes wrong?
Mhm.
Airbnb had what I call an integrity moment with a host by the name of EJ, where EJ hosted a guest who turned out to be a bad guest. I mean, I think bad guest is probably an understatement. They trashed the place, stole items, and were cruel in what they did to EJ's place. And EJ went to Airbnb and said, "This is horrible." And Airbnb said, "This is horrible, but what do you do about it?" And back in the
Yeah.
early days of Airbnb, there were no plans to do anything about it. And EJ suffered a loss of thousands of dollars. And eBay said, "That's terrible." And EJ said, "That's not good enough." And
Mhm.
EJ's story went viral. Articles were written about
Mhm.
it. Brian Chesky, the founder, CEO of Airbnb, really describes it as um, a moment that was a turning point for the company, because Brian didn't know what to do.
Mhm.
And Brian, I think, had always
Yeah.
thought that, well, it's up to the host to figure this out. But and I think Airbnb was a little afraid back at that point, like, we can't be involved in that. Imagine how much money that could cost. But the
Mhm.
articles started piling up. People started talking about it more and more. And Brian really felt like, well, this could be the end of Airbnb. And he went to a board member and said, "Wow, I'm thinking about this. Maybe we should offer insurance. I'm thinking about $5,000 in insurance. What do you think?" And the board member looked at Brian and said, "Add a zero." And
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, Airbnb has since added another zero and then more. They now got $1 million. But the
Mhm.
fact that if people believe that the platform is going to be there for you to help resolve a problem and to insure you against loss, that plays a big role as well. And if you're operating a business at Airbnb scale, where the vast majority of transactions and stays go right, then you can afford to take some of the money from that and provide a product that will build trust for the entire community.
Yeah. What's remarkable to me about eBay and Airbnb, and Cullen Rule, that's one of the people that we have in common, because he created this company Modia for dispute resolution. And we were looking at his data, the eBay data. Most of the transactions were, in our lingo, peaceful. I mean,
Sure.
they went well.
It's
People
almost,
wanted
yeah,
to have,
almost surprising,
yeah.
right? We were surprised at how, when you think about human nature and the potential for problems, wow, 99.8% of transactions go well. And that's awesome. And then you realize, hey, but we're doing millions of transactions a day. So even if 0.1 or 0.2 go bad, that's a lot of problems. And you got to address them, because you know what? It's wonderful when things go well. But if somebody has a bad experience, they're done. They're like, well, I'm not going to that eBay thing anymore. I'm not going to that Airbnb thing. So you got to make sure it's
Right.
not good enough that 99.9% go well. You got to figure out a way to get that last percent over the finish line.
Yeah. And so when you're looking at that last percent and you unpack that, how much of it is malicious? And how much of it is just people being idiots, You're just
Right.
like
Well,
misunderstanding.
Margarita, it's interesting. Everybody sees the world through their own eyes. And,
Mhm.
we all think we have integrity, yet we can all look at the same situation. And because of our life experience, our upbringing, or even our personal interest in the situation, we can see it very
Mhm.
differently. So very, very, very few of them are malicious. Um, if you look at all the problems, what you often find is it's two people looking at the same situation through different eyes and through a different perspective. And sometimes it's just a lack of communication or understanding. So what Colin Rule did, Colin Rule is wonderful. Colin came to eBay and built an online dispute resolution system. And I remember, we had little theme music, we can work it out from the Beatles. And we
Right.
deeply believed that if people came with an open heart and a desire to do the right thing, that if we help on the communication front, we can help resolve a lot of these problems. And we found that that was actually true. And if you can help people communicate and help people see the problem from the other person's eyes, that can help resolve even the vast majority of the remaining disputes. But you're always going to have the knuckleheads. You're always going to have the people that are malicious, or who just are incapable of seeing a problem from another person's perspective. And ultimately, those are the people you want to try to weed out and get off your platform, because they can ruin it for everybody.
Oh, yeah. So what's interesting to me is that, in terms of the work that we've been doing, looking at persuasive technology, and certainly, for people who listen to my podcast, they've heard me say this so many times, that, from 2007 on, certainly this mass interpersonal persuasion and all this data and all this analytics, and it's almost like, creating a microscope for human behavior. It's sort of like the germs were always there, but you just couldn't see them. It wasn't visible to the naked eye. And so now we have like Facebook and Airbnb and all these platforms, and all of a sudden we can see how people actually behave, like in commerce, in hospitality, in all these things. And certainly when we were looking at friending data with Facebook in 2008, 2009, and looking at, well, what's the daily friending data between Israelis and Palestinians? And prior to that, Rob, you and I would probably be sitting over a drink in a bar. It's like, so Rob, what do you think? And he'd go like, nah, nah. Are you kidding? They're mortal enemies. They don't make friendships. And then with Facebook, we could see, oh, actually, they do. People who self-identify as Palestinian is publicly saying that this Israeli is their friend because, it's in their friend group, and and they're not anonymous. They have real names, and they're real people with real locations. And you go like, oh, my assumptions about the world and about human nature might not be correct, because we think that people are bad, or they're going to be malicious, or they're going to be, we assume too much bad behavior on people, when in fact, most of the time we're being good to each other.
Right. Well, Margarita, what you're talking about is really at the heart of both eBay and Airbnb. eBay's fundamental, their statement was people are basically good, basically, right? And we believed that, and we believed that if we gave people a chance, they would demonstrate that behavior, and they did. At Airbnb, Airbnb's mission is around something they call belonging. Belonging is this idea that we need to get people out from behind computers, actually spending time with each other. People from different backgrounds, different cultures. Immersive travel is good because it helps us understand that these strange people on the other side of the world that we may have had certain assumptions about, actually they're not that different than we are. And if we sit in a room together and enjoy a drink together, enjoy a meal together, enjoy an experience together, we can change the world, because we can really help people get through a lot of biases and prejudices about each other. That's what Airbnb is all about fundamentally as a company. And that's why I think you've got so many people. That's why I am so passionate about Airbnb and eBay, because I believe that they demonstrate how we can get to the next level as a planet, and start to get closer as human beings and understand each other.
Yeah. I think that is still the potential of all these technologies and all these platforms, and where we've poured so much of our research and our efforts, and saying, actually business can be a positive force for good in the planet, in terms of, as my co-founder Mark Nelson often says, when you look at where people spend most of their time, most of their life, a third of their life, it is in the workplace. interacting with people who are different from themselves, right? And so when you look at a platform like Airbnb and eBay, it creates more opportunities for us to interact with people who are different from ourselves. And the way we design those platforms, if we do it intentionally, where we put the safeguards in place, where we put the trust mechanisms in place, where we do all these things, it can allow us to really elevate how good we can be to each other. So Airbnb at its very best is sort of, we consider it a peace tech company because it's actually creating positive peace in the world. It's saying like, we had an experience where we were staying in The Hague, in the apartment of a young man, and we actually got to meet him. We went out to dinner with him, and it started a wonderful relationship where we said like, oh, now that we know who you are and we're from California, from Silicon Valley, what can we do for each other? So it wasn't just about spending the night or spending the week in his apartment, but it actually opened the opportunity for other collaborations and ways for us to create value for each other. I would be delighted if Airbnb was able to collect those kinds of stories of saying, okay, yeah, the visit was the spark for some kind of, larger relationship, some way to create value that wouldn't have been possible otherwise
That's
if they
right.
hadn't met
There's a
through
book in
Airbnb.
there. I think you're right.
You think?
Stories,
You think it's
yeah,
called intentional
stories of
integrity?
belonging and connection from Airbnb, because we hear them all the time. We get these all the
Yeah.
time at Airbnb. We hear the stories, and they are inspirational, and they motivate why people come to work every day.
But at the same time, things do go awry. So a couple of years ago at Airbnb, there were issues of bias among the hosts. How
Sure.
did the internal team respond to that?
Yeah. Well, you're talking about back, I think, in 2016. We started getting reports of users being turned down, guests being turned down because of the color of their skin. There was a hashtag Airbnb while black, and a number of
Yeah.
users started sharing stories about how they were having trouble because hosts wouldn't accept them and wouldn't let them book a stay in their home. And I think at first the company didn't believe it. It's a very idealistic company, right? You're headquartered in the Bay Area. There's a great deal of, I think, acceptance and celebration of diversity. And I think the company found it hard to believe. But boy, the stories grew, the momentum grew, lawsuits started coming in, right? And
That'll get your attention.
I got my attention as a lawyer for sure. And so I did my research on what's the law, right? What's Airbnb's legal responsibility when this sort of thing happens on the platform? And I went to talk to the Brian Chesky, the founder, and I started going through the law with him. He held up his hand and said, "I don't care." I said, "What do you mean you don't care?" He said, "Rob, our mission is around belonging and helping people from different backgrounds and different cultures to get to know each other and connect." He said, "If this is happening on our platform, we're failing as a company," right? Mm-hmm. And he said, "So I don't really care what the law says we have to do or don't have to do. We're going to fix this. And I don't care how much money it costs us. This is fundamental to who we are. And it can't be happening on our platform if we're going to be successful." And so, the company, went out and invested, engaged in a number of partnerships, put together a significant internal team to reevaluate the product and how it was operating. One thing we did was we basically put up a wall to the website, and we said, at Airbnb, we expect you to accept everyone, regardless of the color of their skin, their race, their nationality, their gender. And we ask everybody to agree to that as a premise to joining and using Airbnb. And this wasn't the law in many places, but it was fundamental to what we were about. We lost a little over 1% of our users who just simply wouldn't agree to this simple statement. And Brian's response was, "I don't care," because we're better off in the long run standing for something like this. We know what our North Star is. We know what our purpose is. And we believe over the long run, we're going to be a lot more successful by standing for something like this. And I think it was the right decision.
Yeah. So, when we talk about, we did a industry survey earlier this fall, asking people, about ethics, like, do you have someone in your organization that's focused on ethics, an individual, much less a team? Do you have an ethical framework in terms of how you operate, a code of conduct, things like that? And well over half of the respondents said no. But in the comments, because we had this qualitative portion as well, they go like, you know, um, ethics is too expensive. Only bigger companies who are profitable can afford to do that. I'm a small startup. I can't, all these things. And then other people were saying like, the industry needs to do this. So there was a lot of finger pointing on the one hand, and the other is like, oh, this is something that is aspirational for later. What do you say to startups around this? Because we've been making the argument like, no, wait a minute, you got this all upside down.
Yeah. And
You
it has
need
to
to
start from
operate
the
with
beginning.
integrity. You need to start working from a point of ethics, right?
Yeah, it has to start. In fact, it's far easier to start right from the beginning. Like Hewlett Packard, when they started in their garage, it was something that was part of their initial principles that they wrote and thought about right from the beginning.
Mm.
It's hard to turn around a big ship, right? You're a big company like Google or Facebook. Hard to make big fundamental changes to your culture and what you stand for at that point. When you're starting out, the first 10 people you hire, well, they're going to each hire the next 10. So if you send a message early on about, look, this is the way we're going to operate. These are the kind of people we want. This is what we are going to do as a company and what we're going to stand for. It
Mm.
gets instilled throughout the entire culture right from the beginning. And I believe eBay and Airbnb were able to do that. And I think it was very powerful. Look, a company has to stand for something. Every company needs a purpose, and profit is not purpose. Profit is an important part of running a business because without making money, you can't survive. Yet you got to stand for more than that. If you want to inspire your employees, you want to inspire your customers and last for the long run. So you need to understand what that is very early on when you're building a company. What is it that you're going to stand for? Why do you exist and why are you good for the world? When you can nail that, I think that actually is the building blocks on which you can build a great company. If you're
Mm.
not thinking about that right from the beginning, it's not a convenient, oh, it's time to add that on. We're now going public. It's not that simple. There's a
Right.
misconception that it somehow costs money. Uh, the data shows companies that have a purpose, that operate with integrity, actually outperform the market and outperform their peers. So the funny thing is, there's value in having values. If you want to have
Yeah.
financial success, you've actually got to be building this into your culture, thinking about it right from the very beginning. Doing it is something that I talk about in the book. You need to be intentional about it, but you don't need to spend money on it. It's really about mind sharing communication. It's about communicating what you believe in and how you want to operate, sending a message that you're not going to operate illegally. That doesn't mean that it's going to cost you money. I actually think it's going to help you attract better employees and retain them. And we also know that we live in an age of conscious consumerism. Consumers are
Mm.
spending money based upon their perception of the company they're doing business with. If the company they're doing business with has values that resonate with them, not only are they going to be customers, they're going to be champions and they're going to help you and your
Yeah.
brand grow. So get this right early on. It can propel your company.
Yeah. I think that people are looking for compelling opportunities to make a difference, either as employees, as founders, as customers, as stakeholders. I think that if the 2020 is the year that keeps on giving, right? As we look at, how something like COVID exposes all the vulnerabilities that we have. And, in academia, we talk about intersectionality, but it's the Venn diagram of COVID and everything else. It's like, okay, it's showing us all the inequalities that were always there, right? But it just sort of like you can't unsee it, right? Because
The
it's
magnifying
just so
glass, I think it
blatant.
actually puts more of a spotlight on it.
Right. And so even so Airbnb and eBay were committed to do the right thing because they had these founders who were coming in with this moral compass. But as you know, we have plenty of poster children in Silicon Valley where the CEOs have had what appears to be extraordinary success, market success, and yet they have these toxic cultures. How do we square that circle? I mean, because Rob, someone's going to say, but look at this company. They're like an amazing unicorn, and yeah, they're awful internally, but they're making bank.
Yeah.
What do you say to that?
I think it catches up with you. In other words, I think that if you want to build a company to last for the long run, you need to build a company that has integrity and ethics right from the beginning. I mean, look, the larger companies are now finding that they've had to go back and try to scramble on this. And I'll point to Facebook and Google as a couple of companies I think that didn't necessarily get it right from the beginning, but boy, it's costing them now. They have regulators that are coming at them. They have a lot of unhappy consumers. Their own employees are out marching, right? So WeWork and Uber are two examples, I think, of companies that had great promise, but their shine is certainly lost quite a bit, and they are not now what I would call models of successful companies. I think in part because they didn't think about this stuff from the very beginning, and you can already see how their failures from an integrity perspective have destroyed really billions of dollars of value that otherwise might exist in these companies.
Yeah, I was noticing. I think it was, well, 2 springs ago, because obviously we didn't have a real academic spring this year, where students were ashamed to interview with Facebook and Google.
Yeah.
They were
Right.
kind of going like, I don't actually want to tell people that I'm interviewing or that I got a job offer, because they were feeling morally uncomfortable with that,
Yeah.
right? And
And
so
that's
then
a
there's
bad
like this
sign.
peer pressure.
That's
Yeah,
a
it's like,
bad sign for the future. And that's almost like a forward indicator, looking indicator of where those companies may be going. Margaret, I think people have a short memory about things. Let's go back to the late, like the early 2000s, back when I was at eBay. There were four big companies back then. The world, everybody looked at these four tech companies as this is the future. These four companies are going to dominate the landscape for decades and decades to come. Who were those four companies? Well, they were AOL, Yahoo,
yeah,
Amazon, and eBay. Of those four companies, now, I mean, we're talking 15 years later, not that long, really, in the big scope, the big picture of things. How many of those big four are still dominant players in the landscape? And I'd argue that there's one, and that's Amazon.
right.
Where's AOL today? Where's Yahoo today?
Yeah.
eBay, by the way, I think is I think got off track and got off course for a while, but I think they're starting to make a comeback now. But my point is that the world does change, and things do move rather quickly. If you enjoy a great deal of success today, if you're not built to last, you may find that success to be fleeting. I think it's going to be fascinating. 10 years from now, look at the big companies today. How, if you believe like I do, that at least half of them won't be a major player 10 years from now, and I think history would bear that out. Who will they be? Who will still be seen as a major force in the world just 10 years from now? I think the landscape may look very different.
So Rob, let's get real tactical and concrete. Okay, so we have people who are saying like, this is all great and good, but how do I operationalize integrity? So, being a behavior designer, trained by BJ Fogg, we always say like, you got these aspirational like blah blah blah, right? So like that's rhetoric, but when the rubber meets the road, what is it that you actually do? So
Right.
if I'm gonna hire you to be my chief culture designer for creating ethical cultures. What do we do on day one? What are we doing on day two? What is it that our engineers are doing on Monday morning to actually bring these concepts, these aspirations to life? So it's an everyday thing. What does operating with integrity look like in an organization?
Well, I think you got to start with your North Star. And
Mhm.
some companies, I don't think have put thought into that. They're thinking about, how do I make money? I think the first thing I would start with is some talk with the founders and the top leadership and the board of the company to carefully define what my North Star is. What's my purpose? Why does my company exist? Why is it good for the world? And then I want to understand who my stakeholders are. It's not good enough anymore to say that, well, we are here only for our shareholders. The truth is, the new world dictates that companies understand who their stakeholders are, and they owe something to all their stakeholders. So I start to define those stakeholders. And I'd start to define what metrics look like to define the success of those stakeholders. You know, Margarita, in business, you do what you measure. And companies are
Mhm.
really good at measuring the financial stuff, right? Everybody's really good at knowing what your profits are, what your expenses, your revenues, and the like. So if you want to be successful from an integrity perspective, you've got to start measuring some things that are important. And I think you need to measure the health of your stakeholders. So at Airbnb, it's not enough to know what your overall profit numbers look like or revenue numbers. You need to know what are metrics that we could do, that we could start looking at to understand the health of our host. If
Mhm.
Uber had really recognized that its drivers were critical stakeholders and understood the economics of driving and done things to help those economics, I think they'd be in a much better position today, frankly. I would do that sort of thing. Once you've done that, I think you got to look internally. You need a code of ethics, not something that your law firm sends over, not something that you go online and take from another company and copy and paste and then email out and say, okay, everybody, check a box, right?
Right.
I think you need to create your own code of ethics that is fundamentally steeped in your purpose, your values, and your North Star. It's in your own company's language. And
Mhm.
to do that, you need to avoid the Moses syndrome. In other words, don't have the general counsel go to the mountaintop and come back
The
with
Ten
the stone
Commandments.
tablets. Here it is. I've got all the answers, because one person doesn't have all the answers. We're all biased. We've all got our own perspectives. So what I think you need to do is you need to put together a cross-functional group within the company to put together something that's uniquely yours, and a value statement about how you're going to operate as a company.
Mhm.
Make sure that when the group puts it together, there's input from and complete buy-in from leadership. Because if leadership in the company isn't aligned behind what you want from your rules, then it's worthless. I'll give you a great example of this. At Airbnb, I did a lot of looking at Me Too. The Me Too movement really, I think, powerfully influenced, the work that we did at Airbnb. I was struck by the danger of top leaders at a company engaging in romantic relationships with other employees. Over and over again,
Mhm.
I saw careers ruined, brands ruined, and lives of victims ruined because of this sort of stuff. So I walked into an executive team meeting one day and I said, okay, folks, here's a little background about Me Too. Now, here's the landscape. I propose that the top leadership of Airbnb, the 12 of us in this room, we all agree that we will not engage in any romantic relationship with anyone in the company or any vendor. And there was silence in the room for a minute. One person said, "Oh, Rob,
Mhm.
we're all married or in relationships anyway, so that shouldn't really matter." And I said, "Well, shouldn't matter, but based on what I'm reading,
Right.
that doesn't stop anybody. So, what do you think?" And we actually went around the room and we all looked at each other in the eye and said, "I'm in." So we
Mhm.
actually intentionally made a rule that the executive leadership of the company cannot go there. And if they
Mhm.
ever did, they would be the ones that would have to leave the company, because it would be
Mm.
not only a rule of the code that they violated, but they were violating a promise among the members of the executive team. So without everybody's buy-in, without everybody's commitment, a rule like that goes nowhere. But by putting that in our code of ethics, we sent a message to the entire company. Look, I don't think we broke many hearts in the company when we announced this. I think what we actually did was we sent a message that none of us were going to put anybody's romantic or sexual desires ahead of what was the right thing for the employees and for the company. And I think that's powerful. So
So
get buy-in. and make sure that your leadership is behind it. And then you
Mhm.
need to talk about it. You need not with, an email and a checkbox, but actually have a leader in the company stand up and talk about what you're trying to accomplish with the code, and make
Mhm.
sure that it's something that isn't buried 3 links deep in the corporate intranet. It's actually something that lives in the company.
Yeah. So what strikes me about that story is the willing to actually explicitly talk about something that would be potentially uncomfortable, because it's so easy for us to go like, "Mm, that's never going to happen," or yeah, we should talk about it, but it'll feel awkward. And
Right.
especially anything that's really emotional, people
Well,
tend to avoid, especially in the corporate workplace. Like, if I don't have to deal with that, I just hope that it doesn't come up. And then when it does come up, I don't know how to talk about it. And so then it continues to escalate because we're not comfortable and practiced having uncomfortable conversations.
that's a great point. Leaders are uncomfortable talking about integrity. Maybe it's because they know that they're not perfect and they're afraid of, who am I to talk about integrity? Somebody might point the finger back at me. Maybe it's because they think, well, I'm here to do business. This isn't really about morals or ethics. Uh, my book and really everything I've learned challenges that. I think integrity is a quality that all leaders need to have. And I think that leaders need to talk about it. Silence and ambiguity are the enemies of integrity. You
Mhm.
need to have that conversation because in ambiguity, everyone is free to interpret for themselves what they think the right thing to do is. And we know from science that we all think we have integrity. We all think that, we are going to do the right thing, but we're all biased. And we all have a natural human tendency in any situation to look at it and to try to talk ourselves into the path that is best for us. It's normal, it's human. If we're
Mhm.
good at rationalizing our behavior, if we can say, oh, it's okay that I do this because, well, I've seen somebody else do it,
Mhm.
then people start fudging. It's actually a scientific phenomenon. Dan Ariely at Duke University talks about it. And
Mhm.
you start fudging, and you fudge a little bit more, you fudge a little bit more, and pretty soon you're way out there on a limb doing
Yeah.
things you would never, that everybody would agree don't have integrity. How do you fight fudging? You fight fudging by having an open, honest, direct conversation about things. So everybody knows what the rules are, the way that
Mhm.
we are expected to operate. And but you have to get comfortable with the uncomfortable. You have to have
Mhm.
that conversation. I actually found I was a little worried when I first started, working on the program at Airbnb. We actually have an integrity talk as part of orientation, where I spend an hour talking about these things, all using stories of things that have happened at Airbnb in the past. It's the number one ranked class in orientation in all the surveys because
Mhm.
it brings home how everybody faces issues relating to integrity. It's not something that only happens to a whistleblower. Uh, and I think some people were surprised. I remember there was an executive who came to the company and they came to the session as part of orientation. They sat in the front row. Halfway through, their eyes were like this. They were stunned
Like,
that
yeah.
somebody was actually talking about this. And but the reality is these things are all on people's minds, and people want to hear from a leader on this stuff. And if a
Mhm.
leader talks about the importance of this, what I found is that it's actually inspiring. I'll give you one example. I had a woman who came up to me after one of these integrity sessions, and Margarita, she actually had tears coming down her cheek. And I'm thinking,
Mhm.
oh no, what did I say? Did I do something wrong? And she said, Rob, I was at another big tech company in the Valley. And she said, my boss, my manager kept propositioning me
Mhm.
and he wouldn't stop. And I knew that if I reported it, nothing would happen.
Mhm.
She said, I had to leave my job. She said, this is my first week at my new job. She said, you have no idea what it means to have a leader at my new company stand up and talk about this sort of thing directly and talk about how it's not tolerated here and how we respect people in the workplace. She said, I know if I ever have a problem like this at Airbnb, I got a place I can go and I know that it's
Mhm.
something that the company believes in. That means so
Mhm.
much to people these days. It inspires your workforce. They're waiting to hear from you on it as a leader. You just have to get over the discomfort.
So I want to ask you a deeper question in terms of, and I know that you don't necessarily work with the product development teams within Airbnb, but I'll ask anyway. So, I've been having this running conversation with Mira Lane, who is at Microsoft. She's the director and partner on ethics and AI, and she's been developing this harms modeling framework, which I love, and for my PIN members and my co-op, I've used it as a teaching tool to say, like, let's really unpack harm. you know so when I look at Google's, don't be evil, right? And which was basically their statement, their ethics statement, and then they changed it to say, okay, we're not saying don't be evil anymore. Then now they're saying do the right thing. But talk about vague and vague. It's like,
Yes.
what does that mean in the specific, right? Because you're kind of leaving it to the individual to interpret. With this harms modeling framework, she kind of spells it out, and she's saying, okay, look, we need to look at data dignity. We need to look at injury, and let's unpack injury. Is there physical injury? Is there emotional injury? Is there psychological injury? Is there economic loss? Is there, and I was just struck by how insightful those questions were in terms of whatever AI would be implemented. Is it going to create this unintentional harm? Here's an example of this. If we're collecting data, if this data gets out, will it shame or humiliate the individual? I mean, we're getting super, super specific. I mean, it's not like this vague, abstract wording. You're going like, oh, right, if it was my data and it got out, what would that do to my life, right? And so then you say, do I actually need to collect that data? And those are really thoughtful questions to ask at the point of when you're innovating a new product or service. I'm curious to know if um, within Airbnb, they have those sorts of questions of like, if we add this feature, it sounds good, but does it create a vulnerability for some user that we're not aware of, for some community?
Right.
Um,
When you're building product, that's the time to ask the questions, right? Not
Absolutely.
after the product's built, after it's launched, and after a problem results. So yeah, I mean, I think, and by the way, I really admire what Microsoft does in this area. When people ask me for examples of companies that I think operate with integrity, I think Microsoft has done a lot over the
Mhm.
last 5 to 10 years to demonstrate a willingness to really move their culture and think intentionally about integrity. Doesn't mean that they're always going to get every answer right, but
Right.
the exercise of thinking about it from the perspective of all of your stakeholders. How will how will this product impact each of our stakeholders, and what could go wrong? I think those are great questions that ought to be part of the product design process. But right now, I think in a number of product organizations, they're not thinking about that, and they need to.
Absolutely not. You tell a story in your book about one of the Airbnb employees who was in a motorized wheelchair.
Yeah, yeah. He
Yeah,
um,
and yeah, tell us that story.
well, what after the discrimination um, issue arose at Airbnb, my next thought was, well, I want to prevent the next problem, right? In other words,
Hmm.
we're going to work on race discrimination, but what is you try to see around corners, and
Hmm.
one thing that struck me was we have a number of guests who have some sort of physical disability, and there are stories of them showing up at listings and they're not able to get in the door
Hmm.
because the host said that it was handicap accessible, but handicap accessible can mean different things. And I remember there was one story where a guest in a wheelchair showed up to a place that was supposed to be accessible, and there were two steps between the sidewalk and the front door.
Hmm.
And they said to the host, "You said this was accessible," and the host said, "Well, yeah, once you get in the house, it is." And so,
That's no
we
good.
started, yeah, so we started thinking, um, what could we do? And one thing I noticed right away was I'm looking around the building I don't see anybody inside the building in a wheelchair. No wonder we're not thinking about this, because none of us are, operating with physical disabilities. So, one thing that we did was we went out and we found a company founded by a young man who went to law school, went to business school, but he'd been in a wheelchair since age 5, confined to a wheelchair. And he built a company that was essentially an Airbnb-like platform, but with listings that had been carefully pre-vetted for accessibility issues, and all of the information you might need if you were had a physical disability was there on their website. They built their product, they designed their product so that people who had a physical disability could gather the information for themselves and see whether that listing would meet their needs. And by purchasing the company and bringing that founder in-house, we became a lot more sensitive to the issue, came to understand the needs of that community a lot better. And I think we're able to make some really good strides that were, I think, crucial, not just for guests with disabilities, but helping hosts understand. And also, I think, demonstrating that we cared about a broader community. Because, in the immediate short term, was there an immediate profitability jump the moment we started, putting these features in? No, of course not. But we really feel over the long run, not only was it the right thing to do, but we actually feel that over the long run, it will be financially helpful to Airbnb to reach out to that community and show that we understand and care.
And there's an element here of like, you have someone who's having this barrier and you go like, okay, if you solve it for that one person, you end up solving it for millions of people, right? And so there's this huge dividend. But to me, when I think about, there's like this ethical floor, and Bruce Cahan at Stanford and I've talked about there, you need to know what your ethical floor is. Like, what do you got to do to comply with the law and not get busted, right? Which you're quite familiar with.
That's
And a lot of people, and a lot of people just say like, okay, what's the minimum viable ethics I have to do and not be thrown into the pokey? And you go, all right, got to do that. But then he talks about an ethical ceiling, right? And which is, how good can it be? And then it gets away from, it's not about risk and lawsuit and all that, which is, you want to avoid that clearly, but really about how, and to me, in terms of my work, it's like, how good can we be to each other? How can we create value that's in excess of the cost, right? That's mutually beneficial, but it's also about how can you create, then you start getting into the realm of experience design. How can you create an extraordinary customer experience where people go like, I love Airbnb. Why? Because, I was looking for an Airbnb for my parents and my father doesn't, and it was easy. And whenever we have those opportunities to light people up, where something that they look at with dread, oh, this is going to be really difficult to do, and you make it easy, there's this, I have to think that that elevation in emotion is a net positive in the world. Whenever we can, so it's not just the fact that we did this transaction, which you can do, and there's a bad transaction, there's a neutral transaction. It wasn't great, it wasn't horrible, it was meh. And then this one where you go, I also got this psychic value out of it, this emotional value out of it that I couldn't otherwise have gotten. And that to me is a really interesting innovation design space.
Yeah, I agree with
right?
you. I think that in the push to find an extra little edge that'll give you an immediate bump in something, there too often we aren't thinking about the sort of design that you're talking about that can help you build something great for the long run, that people truly not just use but love, because if they love it, they'll keep using it.
Right. And your company is just sort of, it is beloved. I mean, because you are, it's not doing the right thing in terms of rhetoric or photo ops. It's about it actually, you are actually a net positive in your community. It's
That's
not
right.
just, I think that it's so easy to fall into this extractive, exploitative capitalism. And I think that so many of us are exhausted by that. It's sort of like, how can we have such income inequality because those billionaires going on trillionaires. I mean, there are only so many beds you can sleep in a night, right? I mean, you can only live in one house at a time. You can only eat one meal at a time. So what is this wealth hoarding when so many people are doing without? And if you can, in your everyday practice, say like, one, I'm not going to perpetuate suffering. In fact, in my business practices, I can alleviate suffering, and even better, the people who interact with me are better off because they have been, you know, interacting and creating value for each other. That seems to me, if we could reinvent capitalism,
Right.
and how could we do it in this positive, mutually beneficial way?
I think we're seeing an evolution of capitalism. And I think it's moving in the direction that you're talking about. I think integrity is part of it. I think the fact that leaders are being called out for bad behavior like never before. And the world expects more of companies now than ever before. Just making a profit isn't good enough. We want companies that have a purpose. We want companies that are serving broader stakeholders than just investors. So I think we are at the beginning of a new age of capitalism that I think we're going to see evolve in the next decade or two, that may change winners or losers, frankly, from what we're seeing today.
Right. So, Rob, I know we have 10 minutes left, so I'm going to open it up to the participants on the call to see if they have any questions.
Sure,
If
let's do
not, we're
it.
just going to keep on talking. So Andrew Tran said, when you were telling the story about Brian and saying like that he didn't care, he was just commenting that he was kind of shaken from that. It's like, what do you mean the CEO doesn't care? But then he said, oh, once you explained it, it was like, oh, okay. So,
Yeah,
thank you,
Brian.
Andrew.
Yeah, that shook me in a moment that he said it, because I didn't know Brian very well at that point. But Brian wasn't going to make a decision just to solve a legal problem, because he understood that it wasn't just a legal problem. It wasn't even primarily a legal problem. It was a problem that went to the core of why Airbnb existed. And he treated it as such. Now, for the lawyers in the audience, this actually made the legal angle a lot easier to solve. If I had been dealing with a CEO who said, we're only a platform, to heck with them. People can have whoever they want in their house, and the law doesn't require otherwise. Let's fight it. That would have led to a very different set of legal circumstances. What I was able to do, let's take the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing. They filed a class action against Airbnb on this issue. I called them after that meeting with Brian, and I said, I'd like to come talk to you. And they said, we don't want to talk to you. And I said, please. I said, I'll come down, listen to me for 15 minutes. If you want, you can throw me out after 15 minutes. You don't have to say a word. They said, okay. I went down and told them, look, I said, I don't want to fight you all in this, because frankly, we believe as strongly as you do in the importance of a world where people aren't discriminated against based on the color of their skin. So instead of fighting about the law, why don't we just both agree that this is the goal and that we're going to do everything we can to fulfill that goal, and let's work together. So it actually made it a much easier legal problem to solve, because we looked at the issue as a more fundamental mission-based problem.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Let's see. Lisa Search writes, I'm wondering if there's a way to amplify Airbnb's peace building potential even more through webinars and interviews and stories about building bridges across divides via Airbnb.
I think there is.
That book.
Yeah, there's a book. We talk about that some in my book, and I think you'll see. Airbnb did a Super Bowl ad a couple of years ago, which is unusual for a private company to do that. But we did that because we really fundamentally felt that was a moment where we had an opportunity to make a statement about discrimination and belonging. And so I think Airbnb sees itself not just as a vehicle to make money for investors, but as a vehicle to be a positive force for good in the world. And you may well see Airbnb as part of their communications, starting to share stories about how Airbnb has been a vehicle for good. And look, you see this quite a bit. Airbnb has a nonprofit now, Airbnb.org, that helps people who are displaced by tragic events like refugees from war or from wildfires or earthquakes and the like. So I think you'll very much see Airbnb staking out a position to be a force for good in the world.
Okay, so Mishak Weber asks, what are some of the classic ways that cultured documents miss the mark?
Well, one classic is they're outsourced. Some third party does them, and you can't outsource integrity. You know,
Mhm.
what good is a code of ethics that a law firm wrote or that you stole from somebody else? What about this? How many people got one of these on their wall at a company, right? These
Yeah.
are these compliance posters. The font is so small, I can't read it even this close. And these things are in all the break rooms, sitting off in the corner under some dripping pipes. This stuff doesn't do any good because
Yep.
it's laminated and some third party wrote it. I think the number one mistake that companies make when it comes to culture documents is that they buy something from that somebody else wrote and then they send it out with a checkbox. Another mistake I think they make is that one person goes off and creates it and tries to make that something that the whole company has to take. And I think the right answer to these sorts of things is create these documents internally in your company's own language, incorporating your company's mission and values, and make it an exercise for a diverse group within your company to create, so that when it's done, you've got the automatic buy-in of a number of people within your company who become then spokespeople for what you've created.
Okay. Leah Solorio says, careers industry working with job seekers. What is your thought about blind recruiting and removing bias in resumes?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. You know, we had to think about this a little bit at Airbnb. One of the ways that we fought discrimination on Airbnb. We used to have someone's name and picture publicly available on the website, so that if you were a host, you could see someone's picture and name before you decided to accept them as a guest. And what we decided to do was that did make people comfortable, but it also created the potential for a lot of unconscious and conscious bias. And even though we're a very human company and we were reluctant to do it, ultimately we made the decision to hide people's name and picture until they were accepted for a reservation. So, you know, we ended up going down that route. And I think that's something that LinkedIn has got to be doing a little thinking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, everybody's got their picture and their name obviously at the heart of LinkedIn. I have a tough time imagining LinkedIn without a picture and a name. What would you do? Just have a number at the top of each page with a resume? That seems a little antiseptic, doesn't it? But on the other hand, we've got to be thinking creatively about how to overcome bias and discrimination in hiring. And you know, I think there are other ways to do it because you know, no matter what, unless we're willing to conduct interviews behind a screen, at some point we've all got to become ourselves during the recruiting process. But perhaps, and I know some companies have gone this far. Some companies are reviewing resumes now without looking at the name or the picture, at least for an initial screen, to help overcome bias. And I think that's an interesting way that that companies can start to diversify their workforce and get past, I think, some bias that obviously exists in the early screening process for hiring.
Yeah. So Rob, we're almost at the hour, but we have a ton of questions. Can you hang on for another 10 minutes?
Sure, let's do it.
Okay, great. So I'm kind of bouncing between the chat and the Q&A. The question from Brenda Dalal, how might companies reward and incentivize better, good behaviors internally with metrics that become part of their bottom line? Can ethics be tied directly to financial goals, and how?
Yeah, I think so. Look, the old way of thinking was that a company reported its numbers every quarter, and executive compensation was tied to those numbers. Now, what were those numbers? Well, those numbers are your financial performance. What if companies started reporting numbers that went to things like your ESG numbers, right? Your impact on the environment.
Mhm.
What about even numbers relating to the health of your stakeholder community? And what if executives were compensated not simply on financial performance, but on the health of your stakeholders? Take Uber. What if Uber had started to compensate its executives based not just on user numbers or revenue numbers, but on the financial success of its drivers and
Yeah.
on the satisfaction of its riders? Then you start to incentivize a different type of behavior that might, in the long run, help you build a better, more financially successful company. So, yeah, I actually think you're going to see the world moving in this direction where we're going to start measuring things and disclosing things in reports that aren't simply financial.
Yeah. If I could wave a magic wand and go back into venture capital or be a limited partner, I would say, look, I don't want you to create a company that has 10 employees that has $100 million exit because it got acquired by Facebook. I want you to create a company that generates $100 million of value where you have thousands of employees with a middle class income, healthcare,
Yeah. Right.
and a 401k, because we've kind of hollowed out the middle class in the US because we've taken that away. And people are living paycheck to paycheck, and I go, you can't consider yourself a financial success. You actually don't have a profitable business model if by actually paying people a real wage that they could live on, you're not profitable. And I go, in which case you don't actually really have a company,
Right. And I think
instead of
is
getting
what are you building
donations
for the long run?
from philanthropists, you're getting donations from venture capitalists, right? You got to make it work based on the real cost of making it work, and you can't do it on the backs of other people because you've exploited them.
Yes. I agree
It's
completely.
you're not
I think
actually
that's the way.
it's fake profitable. Okay, we have um And so from Mei-Lin Feng, it feels like Robert is saying corporate ethics is deeply broken. Does he have thoughts beyond advice for insiders and corporations? What about a role for industry and professional associations?
Yeah. Um, I wouldn't say it's on a broad scale deeply broken. I would say that it's broadly neglected. And I think that
Mm,
neglect can manifest itself in some pretty epic fails at companies, like what we've seen at Boeing, for example, or
mm,
Volkswagen with the emissions scandal. And I think that what we need is more intentionality. And we need to we need to understand the fact that companies who do it well are actually going to perform better financially. So I think what I'm calling for here is not necessarily that it's broken everywhere. I would say that in many companies, it is simply neglected. And that is to the detriment of the employees, the shareholders, and the communities where these companies operate. So um, I think I don't remember the second part of the question. I got so
Um,
caught up on.
the role of industry and professional associations, right?
Well, I think
So,
Uh, I think they certainly do have a role to play. Look, I think all of us have a role to play. I think employees, who is holding companies more and more accountable? It's the employees within the companies that are doing it. I think there's a role for government. I think there's a role for professional associations. But if I'm a company, uh, I would prefer to proactively get out in front of these issues rather than being forced by professional associations or governments to do it. I'd rather grab the mantle myself and work with employees as partners to build this into the company so that government and professional associations don't feel the need to do it.
Mhm. Erwin Valencia writes, how does an organization that believes strongly in having a foundation and mission based in integrity and ethics and a strong and clear North Star ensure that we are addressing all necessary or most necessary aspects as we start and as we grow? Even when looking for blind spots, how do we find ones we miss? How much is enough? And how do we best balance the incremental costs of integrity and ethics with the limited resources of a startup or growth organization?
That could be our next hour, Margaret. I think there are a lot of questions in there. Uh, I mean, the first thing I'll say is that there's nothing you can do to ensure that you're catching everything and that there are no blind spots. Integrity is not perfection. If it were, no one would have integrity. I think what it is an intentional effort to be proactive and to try to think through these things in advance. I'll give you one example of something. Um, I used to say at Airbnb, I don't want one chief integrity officer. I want 6,000 of them. I think one of the best ways you can avoid blind spots is to broadly engage with employees as a whole in this effort. Not too often companies feel like, well, legal owns ethics or legal owns compliance or HR owns it. One thing we did was we created a program of ethics advisors at Airbnb. And what we did was we went out and got 30 people in the company, 30 people that were senior enough to have good judgment, but not so senior that they were scary, right? And we pulled them from each department and each office. And we brought them all to San Francisco. And we spent 2 days together talking about integrity and our code. And then we sent them back out to their day job. But everybody on their teams was told, you've got someone on your team now that is an ethics advisor. They've been trained on the code of ethics. They're there to help you. They're a resource for you. If you've got a question, you don't have to be a whistleblower. You don't have to go to legal, which is scary, right? Nobody wants to go to legal. Nobody wants to go to that hotline because the hotline's scary. You're a whistleblower.
Right.
You need those outlets. They're important, but you want a world where people are comfortable talking about integrity as part of their day-to-day. And what we found was that people were far more likely to talk to a colleague in their own department about integrity than they were to go to a hotline or to make that scary phone call to legal. In one quarter at Airbnb, we had over 100 inquiries to ethics advisors, mostly small stuff. Can I join this board? Can I accept this gift from this vendor? But by encouraging the small conversations, and you're sending a message that integrity really matters, and you're more likely to avoid the big problems. So without getting a ton of details, and again, a lot of stuff in the book about this for folks that are really interested. I think one thing you can do is share ownership of integrity broadly.
What heuristics can we use to check ourselves, especially when we may not be able to engage a full-time chief ethics officer? Are we, the founders and founding team, the de facto chief ethics officers?
Well, leaders are chief ethics officers because everybody, I like to say that a CEO or a leader, they're the thermostat for a company, not the thermometer. A thermometer takes the temperature of a room, but a thermostat sets it. By their words and by their actions, the leaders are the ones that are creating the temperature, the ethical temperature of a company. So if you're a CEO and you stomp around and say things like, we've got to hit this number no matter what, we must hit this deadline or heads are going to roll, then what you're doing is you're creating an environment where people feel more comfortable blurring ethical lines simply because the leader told them that this had to get done no matter what. If, on the other hand, you're like Ben Horowitz. Ben Horowitz told me that every quarter he would sit down with his CFO face to face with the numbers. And he would look at the CFO and say, is there anything in this document, anything in these numbers that makes you uncomfortable? Anything in here that's misleading? Anything in here that you think isn't standard? Anything in here that you were forced to do? Because Ben would say, we might miss a number and our stock price might go down, but we're not going to go to jail. We're going to do the right thing. And when you say that, you're setting the thermostat in a very different place. So you as a leader, I think, need to embrace this and understand that you are the thermostat. People watch what you do and what you say. Own it, make it part of your job description.
Right. Natan Zeidenweber writes, can you give an example of the kind of metrics related to stakeholder health and how Airbnb went about collecting such inputs and communicating them internally and externally?
Sure. I mean, I'll give you a few easy examples. One are your guests satisfied? So, for example, it's quite possible to run a platform where you are just trying to maximize the number of stays and the amount of money you're making. Uh, and in that case, for example, you might be satisfied with mediocre hosts that are providing a 3-star experience out of 5, right? Um, but what Airbnb cared about was, are our guests happy? And what is the average score that our guests are giving to their experience on the platform? That matters a lot. That is a separate number than what your revenue number might be. But you're recognizing that you're failing as a company if your guests aren't getting great experiences. You might also look at studies around what is the profitability of our host. Are our hosts making money? Is this a financially successful venture? Are our hosts happy? If our hosts aren't happy, if our hosts are having trouble making ends meet financially, then we're not succeeding as a company. So I think the fact that they're thinking about these sorts of things and collecting that kind of information and factoring it into decisions is powerful.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting because I think about the restaurant delivery services that are out there, right? Especially with COVID, and then reading about restaurateurs going like, yeah, these delivery services are actually killing us because the markup to deliver and so on, it became exploitative to the restaurateurs, to the restaurant businesses, because they're going like, we have to change our pricing. It creates this overhead, and we're being bombarded by these takeout orders, but it's actually not good for us. We're not thriving. It's actually not good business for us to have. It's actually very expensive business for us. But these companies are making bank, of course, because they don't care about that. They're saying, okay, we just are going to do the delivery. So it would have imagined that if they were saying like, let's check in with our network of restaurants. Are you actually more profitable now? Are we a net positive for you? Right?
Yeah,
Or,
that's right.
this relationship net positive for you, not just for us.
That's right.
And if that came like the new metric for all your vendors in your ecosystem, that
Things
would
will
be
be
a game
different.
changer.
And I think, because look, if your stakeholders aren't happy with you, in the long run, they're going to leave you in a second as soon as there's a better alternative. You're not
Mhm,
building something that I think is really meant and built to last. So
mhm,
I think that's my message to any platform. Understand who your stakeholders are, listen to them, and understand what makes them successful, and factor that into your decision making.
mhm.
And I think that will help you build something that's great for the long run.
So I'm going to end with a statement from Colin Rule. So hi, Colin.
Colin, hi, Colin.
So he
Colin,
says,
by the way, for those of you who don't know Colin is probably, in my mind, the leading voice in the world on dispute resolution online.
that's
Colin,
right.
when eBay didn't know what to do with all the disputes that users were having with each other, eBay called Colin and convinced Colin to come to work and help them build a system, a terrific system that's used to this day. So I admire Colin's work in the area of dispute resolution, and it's cool that he's on the call.
Okay, so he says, I worked on Rob's team at eBay in trust and safety, and he did an excellent job ensuring that all of us on the team were thinking about ethics and integrity, primarily by modeling those concerns in his own decision making. I think it's crucial that everyone in an organization feels that their managers and leaders take ethics seriously and that they'll be backed up if they make the ethical choice. Well said, Colin.
Thank you, Colin.
Rob,
That's very nice. I appreciate that.
this was such a wonderful conversation. You have your book out. It's called Intentional Integrity. It's filled with real world stories about what integrity looks like in action. Yes, excellent. It's a great book. I'm
I
reading
just
it on
happen to have a
Kindle and
copy here.
highlighting all over the place. Um, Even though Rob and I use different language, we're talking about the same thing. You know, companies ethically run, products that are ethically designed, where there's mutual value for all the shareholders, is a form, it is a powerful force for good in the world. It is a way to actually create positive peace in the world. And especially now, where we lived in such a polarized world, what can we do as individuals and as companies to knit society back together, to build that connectedness, to build that trust, and to do that at scale? I think that's some of the most important work that all of us can do in order for us to rebuild our society and then be prepared for the biggest existential challenges like pandemics and climate change and all the challenges that we're going to have in the coming decades. But we got to get the trust, the integrity, actually bring real meaning and action to doing the right thing, as opposed to that slogan in that break room wall that nobody reads, right?
Uh,
So
Margaret,
Rob,
thanks for
what,
having me. For those that are
so
interested in this topic, I'm on LinkedIn and I do a post about integrity almost every day. So welcome any of your listeners to reach out and connect with me and join the conversation. Thanks for having me.
fantastic. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everyone.